Megan, thank you so much for joining us here at CAIS20. It's fantastic to have your insights here at the conference. You're going to be talking today on a panel about sort of the opportunities. We're in a new decade. What do you think are the biggest opportunities and challenges facing this industry at the moment?
Well, we've just come off this incredible bull run in 2019 in terms of equity markets in particular, and I think most investors are wondering how long this can last. We're really long in the tooth in this recovery, so it has to end at some point. The question that everybody's asking is, when is it going to end? And so I'm looking at cyclical and structural factors, and I think I'm not the only one. A lot of economists are talking about cautious optimism these days, and the optimism piece comes from the short-term cyclical indicators that we're getting. So a lot of the data, the confidence data, the survey data, so the PMIs are looking fairly good globally. They're looking better in the US, but in Europe there are suggestions that Europe's starting to stabilize. China's provided all kinds of monetary stimulus to offset a slowdown and also now the coronavirus. And so a lot of the cyclical indicators suggest that growth is okay. It's not fantastic, but it's fine. It's continuing along lines of trend growth. What's really scary are the structural factors, and I think as we start this new decade, people are starting to wonder when these structural factors will really come home to roost. And those things include, a massive oversupply of savings. So there's a savings glut, and that pushes down interest rates, and so that's partly why interest rates have been stuck so low for so long. That's part of the secular stagnation debate. Low productivity growth is another issue. Inequality is, I think, probably the issue of our time, and it's driven by a whole bunch of things, including globalization and technological advancement. And it's contributing to the savings glut, actually, so that the more inequality you have, the higher the savings generally. There's a lot of research suggesting that. The oversupply of debt that we have globally, that, as long as interest rates are really low, which they're kind of stuck low for a while, that isn't a problem. But at some point, if interest rates ever rise, we're going to have a huge problem globally. And so some of these structural factors are, I think, what investors are starting to worry about as we begin this new decade.
You talked there about globalisation and what's happening sort of geopolitically having an effect. What do you think are the biggest risk factors? Because obviously we've sort of talked a lot about the relationship between the US and China, but what else is out there and what is on the horizon?
So trade is at the center of everyone's mind, and that involves the US and China. But now that there's a phase one deal, which, by the way, I think is just a temporary détente, it doesn't fundamentally get at the issue of who's the biggest economy based on excellence in these high-tech sectors. So I think that will come back. But now the U.S. is turning towards Europe and has threatened auto tariffs, for example, a number of times. I think there's a very high chance we could get them, actually. So I think tensions between the U.S. and the EU are an issue as well. And generally, I think what we're seeing is a change in the world order, right? So we had a system before. President Trump largely has come in and taught us that we're not going to have that system going forward. The issue is that we don't know what system we're going to still. And so while we're kind of stuck in this middle ground, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's caused businesses to delay and defer their investment. And that's been a real drag on growth. It's been a real drag on productivity as well. So I think we're stuck in this middle ground for a long time.
Does that avoid also make it problematic to look at issues like climate? Because obviously at this conference we're talking a lot about responsible investing and ESG. Yeah. Who takes the reins when perhaps those governments aren't talking to each other? Does it have to be big business and finance?
Yeah, so I do think that there's a big question about kind of global governance and who's really setting the standards. It used to be the US. Now it might not be. A lot of our allies certainly don't really trust us anymore. It could be China. But in terms of climate, I think there is a real question. China's not really leading the game in that. But the US is really far behind as well. And actually, it's Europe that's been years ahead of most of the rest of the world on climate. And so I do think that there's an opportunity for Europe, Australia, New Zealand, some of these other smaller areas that are kind of stuck in the middle to perhaps, band together and take charge. But as you rightly point out, it's not just governments who need to lead this, it's companies as well. And the ESG movement is absolute table stakes in the US now. So that's a real development over the past 12 months, I'd say, and that's positive. So far, I think it's mainly just kind of a large bureaucracy that's a marketing trick. And so you have to start somewhere, and taxonomy is where we need to start. But I don't actually see behaviors really changing off the back of it.
So you see this as an opportunity for real action now? rather than just talk, perhaps?
I hope so, right? So far, I think it is mainly just talk, right? The questions get asked and the questions get answered, and everybody ticks their boxes, and no behavior really changes. Massive investment patterns don't really change. But you have to start somewhere, like I said, and so maybe this is the beginning of actually taking this issue seriously and finally getting real action. I mean, you have seen CEOs of very large companies come out in favor of ESG principles. We'll see if they really put their money where their mouth is.
So Megan, just finally, we're at the start of a new decade. We're fast approaching the 2030s before we know it. What do you expect to see in this decade in terms of innovation, and what are you excited about?
So I think I'm most excited about innovation in healthcare, which is a huge issue, not just in the US, but elsewhere given global demographics. And that's an issue across developed and also developing countries, particularly if you look at China. So the more that we can involve artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, and can really kind of tinker healthcare towards individuals, I think the more effective it might be, and the more that costs might come down, which is particularly an issue in the US given our healthcare system. So I think that's a huge opportunity that by 2030, hopefully we'll have made some real inroads on. And also I think in addition to healthcare, sort of care for the elderly, it's typically considered sort of a low wage, low hour job, and so not particularly coveted, but the demand for that is just going to grow. And I think that there's a real opportunity for technology to come in and fill that space.
Megan, great to talk to you as always. Fascinating insights. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.